Good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon, friends. It's very good to have you all here today. Today we continue with our monthly seminar presentations. Today we have a speaker from the OECD in Paris, in France, which I'm about to introduce. We have Oriana Romano. Dr. Romano is head of Unit for Water Governance, the Blue and Circular Economy, Urban Policies and Sustainable Development Division of the OECD. She leads OECD work on water governance and has coordinated several policy dialogues and multi-stakeholder platforms. Her expertise focuses in particular on the sustainable use of natural resources at the local level through a multi-level governance approach. Prior to joining the OECD in 2013, she was a research assistant and university lecturer in environmental economics at the Center for International Business and Sustainability at London Metropolitan University, as well as at the Department of Social Science of the University of Naples in Italy. She holds a PhD in institutions, economics, and law of public services. Oriana, we are very happy to have you here with us today. You are welcome to share your screen and to kick off with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'm very happy to be here, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this seminar series. Perhaps a few words about the OECD, in case not everybody is familiar with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. This is an intergovernmental organization of 38 member countries. We are based in Paris, as a professor just said, and what we do is really to support countries with policy making and implementation of these policies, especially if they're going through reforms. And in my role as a head of the water governance program is to make sure that countries are equipped or are aware of the tools that would allow better water services, prevention of water risks, or an efficient and effective management of water resources, because water governance is a means to an end. So it's not an end per se, but it's really the way by which this type of objectives can be achieved. So I have been working for the OECD for the last 15 years, and I have accompanied a number of countries, cities, and regions. We have also worked, for example, with South Africa, really to accompany countries or different levels of government when they face water challenges, but also when they are looking for new opportunities, ideas, solutions that are taken from other countries and seems to be successful. Because one of the main issues is really the possibility of sharing this type of best practice across countries. But also, of course, I have a good and robust database thanks to which take informed decision making. And this is what we do at the OECD, provide data, analysis, and facilitate experience sharing with across countries. So allow me to share my presentation now, as I thought that probably a few slides would help also visualize what I would like to share with you in the last, let's say, 20-25 minutes. and then we're gonna leave time for discussion. So should you have any questions during my presentation, please don't hesitate to note them down, and feel free to ask any questions at the end of the presentation. I will be very interested to have a discussion with you all. So I've been asked to provide you with a few reflections on water governance. Of course, this is what I'm doing in my daily working life, and especially to look at the trends and the new pathways for the hydrological transition. And I have to say that this comes at a very important and strategic time for us at the OECD Water Governance Program, because in 2015 we developed what we called OECD principles on water governance. About 10 years ago, talking about water governance, I guess, was even more complex than nowadays, because water governance is really a sort of umbrella concept, difficult to understand, different across countries and within countries. So what we did at that time was really to work with OECD member countries, OECD partner countries, and more than 150 stakeholders from the private, the public, the non-for-profit sectors, gathering within an initiative at the OECD, which is a multi-stakeholder platform, which is called Water Governance Initiative. We gather all of them for a couple of years, actually. That was a long process. And we managed to define 12 principles that describe what water governance is for government. And I'm going to be talking about these principles during my presentation, but I think it's important already to share with you this information, because the principles represent really a milestone for the program and for clarifying a concept that is intrinsically very, very complex. But now we are at the 10 years of these principles that, as I said, were developed in 2015. So we are asking the question, what has happened in the last 10 years? Can we say that countries have actually followed different trends when it comes to water management and water governance? Are they using different tools? Are they making changes in their regulations or in their legislation? And what are the new pathways for the hydrological transition? Are we continuing to do water governance as 10 years ago? What is that we have learned? So this presentation for me really comes at a very pivotal time when we are asking ourselves and the countries we're working with a number of questions, which of course do not find just one response, but they help really to reflect on the past and on the future. So of course, at the OECD, what we do is to write reports and put everything in written so that is available for everyone. And that's why all these reflections in terms of past lesson learned, changes, and future pathways will be included in a report that will be published in December 2026. So I'm going to be sharing here some preliminary results of this report and some considerations that will be part of our studies past, and also this new report that is going to be published in a few months. Let's see, should be able to share the new slide. Okay, so let's start with, I have a few blocks. I've divided this presentation in a few blocks. So let's start with changes in the global landscape affecting water management. So we're taking into account here 10 years time from 2015, let's say, to 2025. You will see that I will mention data, for example, from 2013 to 2023, but just because really these are the most recent data, either from OECD or from UN sources, and especially in relation to the Sustainable Development Goal, the SDG 6 on water. One thing that we have seen as one of the first messages is that when it comes to water stress, we see a sort of global stability within the last 10 years, which, by the way, masks some pressure that are intensifying in some specific countries. And what it is interesting is that countries that were already facing 10 years ago intense levels of water stress are basically worsening their levels. But there is also a regional differentiation when it comes to water stress, which has important policy consequences. So when it comes to global water stress between 2013 and 2023, we saw very little difference, around 17%. But this pressure is concentrating in places that were already exposed to scarcity at our baseline year, so 2013. Increasingly, there has been a demand for agriculture, which globally covers like between 70 and 80% of water demand. But we have seen also industry, in particular manufacturing, and demand in cities due to, in many cases, demographic changes and urbanizations in relation to water. This high water stress, especially in some regions like Western Asia, Northern Africa, Southern Eastern Asia, where in the future the majority of megalopolis, megacities will exist, are actually posing a policy issue where stress in terms of water and water scarcity is intensifying, and how water stress is actually interacting with water demand. OECD countries that showed global stress above the average in 2023 are 15 over 38 OECD countries. So you can see that almost half of them are actually subject to water stress issues, posing the policy issues about trade-off, especially across economic activities. Another message is that when it comes to flood, and especially flood risks, the hotspots are not limited to high-risk countries. What you are expecting is that flood will be happening basically in countries that historically have showed a certain level of pressure in terms of exposure to floods. This may be true up until a certain point. In fact, when we see disaggregated data at regional level, we see that even in countries that have a low national average in terms of exposure to floods, can contain regions with very high exposure. So, for example, at regional level, Canada, Germany, Finland, Norway, and Sweden shows really high exposure to floods at subnational level. So more than 130 OECD regions are those in which 20% of the population is exposed in particular to river flooding. 2% of the population is exposed to coastal flooding at national level. Another message is, or another trend is about fresh water availability per person, which is falling. So there is a stability when it comes to natural resources that can translate into growing scarcity per capita due to population changes or demographic changes. There is a reduction by 10% of global renewable freshwater resources per capita that we have seen in the last 10 years, 2013 2023. 31 OECD countries recorded declines in freshwater resources per person. And really, there is no such an increase that we can see at global level in terms of freshwater availability. What does it mean? It means that even if at global level we take this stable picture in terms of freshwater renewable freshwater availability, if we consider population rising, then we will be having less water per person. And in particular, this becomes important in some countries in which there is a decrease in freshwater resources availability, such as Luxembourg, Iceland, and Israel. And so planning about this demand growth against certain drivers, and in particular climate change, are very important to foresee effective policies in the future. When it comes to access to safe drinking water and sanitation, we see that in OECD countries, the coverage rates are quite high. So over 95%, and we're talking about in drinking water, up to 87% when it comes to sanitation. So really little variation if we want to see the difference in the last 10 years, with a little bit of improvement, of course. But there are some gaps that remain, especially if we look at urban-rural disparities, and specifically in some countries of the OECD area, such as Mexico, Costa Rica, and Colombia in Latin America, and Poland in Europe. So access is kind of universal, let's say, in OECD countries, but there are a number of differences at territorial level. If we are looking at the trends, so if we are looking at the future, there are certainly some drivers that are likely to increase pressure on water systems. I already mentioned climate change. Climate change is already responsible for a number of impacts that actually manifest themselves in the form of water-related events, whether they are drought, floods, or even extreme water events like hurricane and so on. Actually, 80% of climate change consequences manifest themselves through water issues. Population is projected to grow by 2050, and we have seen that this has an impact in terms of availability of fresh water resources per capita, but also urbanization is supposed to grow by 2050. 70% of the population will be urban by 2050, which means that the demand for water in cities, and specifically in those areas, in those regions, in particular Africa, in African countries and Southeast Asia, that will host the biggest cities in the world, then we'll be facing challenges in terms of trade-off for the use of the resources, but also in terms of the capacity to guarantee access to safe drinking water and sanitation, especially in cases in which informal settlements exist. When it comes to economic growth, OECD data show that between 2011 and 2060, that would be projections in terms of increase, like up to 4 times the level of GDP, which will, especially when it comes to increase income per capita, will especially be related to middle income sample of the population, of the global population, which means an increase in production, an increase in consumption, and so in agriculture, in terms of agriculture, industrial activities, and electricity, to name a few type of water uses. So there would be a number of risks that are related to these increased pressures on water system. 40% of people will be living in water-stressed basins. 1.6 billion people will be at risk of flooding. 1.4 billion people will be without access to basic sanitation globally. And 240 million will be without access to safe drinking water and sanitation if we don't if we don't take action today. So the policy question is not only how much water, but where is the risk, and what are the type of activities and initiatives that can be taken today in order not to move to the emergency, to the crisis, to a response type of intervention. And I'm going to be talking about this in a bit. Water underpins key transitions, which means that it's very important that decisions are taken in other places, in other policies that is not water, considering the impact that these activities will be having on water. On digital transition, for example, we have been reading and hearing a lot about data center, and there is so much talking about the use of energy and electricity. How about the use of water for cooling, for example? 45% of data centers are in river basin at high risk of water availability disruption. And there are already some cases, for example, in Latin America, but also in Italy, where I'm from, to actually debate and avoid that this data center will occupy soil and will use resources, including water, that will have an important impact on the availability of the resource for the future. When it comes to the green transition, a number of industries and products that are part of, for example, renewable energy intervention requires lots of water per year. We can think about a large battery plant, for example, that requires around 1 million of cubic meters of water per year. Industrial transition. This is becoming really very high on the agenda of a number of countries about reindustrialization and regional development. But this reindustrialization, in particular manufacturing, will be a very high level sector for water demand. For example, the semiconductor industry consumes around 200 trillion liters of water annually, almost half in areas that are actually water scarce. So where these industries are placed, the type of activities and the permission to actually conduct these activities will depend on a number of issues, including water. And sometimes this is not the case. For the demographic transition, I have already mentioned that some OECD regions are projected to grow, but some others are also projected to lose between 20 and 30% of their population by 2050. So what will be the future of water networks, water infrastructure, which remain largely fixed in size because they have been built 20, 30, 50, sometimes 100 years ago. So how to adapt a water network and water-related infrastructure when actually the population is not going to be used this water network at the maximum capacity, which means also that less people is going to pay for the service. And then there would be issues also in relation to maintenance and the economic sustainability of those infrastructure. So this is to say that place-based policies are essential to strengthen water resilience and ensure that no territory, area, region is left behind. But this means that policymakers will have to take into account this geographical composition of the hydrological system, and especially the risks to which a territory will be increasingly exposed in the future. Because as I tried to demonstrate, providing you some examples with data, is that water scarcity is increasing where actually issue of water scarcity exists already, but also in countries that were not subject to this type of stress. Same for floods, and same we can say for pollution in relation to a number of economic activities. So if we consider the mega trends and the like climate change, urbanization, economic and demographic change, then we'll see that it's really needed to consider case by case, and especially policies that will take into account this type of territorial characteristics. This is the picture. So now, what is that water governance can do about managing this complexity and water resources in particular? What we know is that, and what we have seen at the OECD through a number of studies, analysis, data collection, reports, and policy dialogue, is that in most of the cases, water crises are often governance crises, which means that there seems to be, especially in some cases, enough water for human and nature needs, but this is not managed wisely. In some other cases, coping with water risks requires more than financing and hydrology, which is something we are used to think about. In many cases, the first response is to provide water supply. So through infrastructures and water network. How about water demand? How about changing what doesn't work in terms of regulation, in terms of financing, in terms of how stakeholders, and when I mean stakeholders, I mean civil society, business, are approaching water demand and use. In many cases, the solutions exist, especially when it comes to technology, use of technical solutions exist, but implementation is lagging. And this is lagging because sometimes enabling condition for making this solution applied on the ground are not in place. And as I was mentioning at the beginning, governance is a means to an end. It serves to manage too much, too little, too polluted water, provide access to safe drinking water and sanitation, but it's not an end per se. We don't do water governance for the sake of doing water governance. We put in place some enabling condition to solve some issues and to achieve some objectives. But water is a very complex sector, is very fragmented, and is sensitive to multi-level governance. It's a local issue with global impact. Multiple actors are implied at different levels. It's capital intensive, monopolistic, intensive, and subject to market failure when we talk about providing water services. There are a number of interdependencies across multiple stakeholders, which in some cases are poorly managed, but not just for today's need, also for the future. Trade-off. How do we manage a trade-off between the water that is needed for domestic purposes, the water that is needed for agriculture, when actually policies in relation to agriculture are subsidizing, for example, certain production which are water intensive and so on. So interdependencies, but also trade-off. And also in many countries, there is a struggle to really understand and clarify who does what. And I'm going to show you in a bit what I mean by that. So there is no one-size-fits-all solution, but a need to conceive policies that are place-based, that take stock of what works well and what doesn't work in order to improve, that consider a number of stakeholders that have a role alongside policymakers at different levels, because water governance is a mix between top-down and bottom-up approach. And also there is the need to match the type of governance structures to the type of water risks to face. So in summary, when it comes to water governance, it's not just about what to do, because we said that there are a number of solutions that exist already, but also who does what, why, what is the purpose, what is the objectives, what are the targets, at which levels of government, and how. And I would add also with whom, because we have mentioned the important role of the stakeholders. So a decade of work fostering water dialogue, informed about a number of these issues that I've just mentioned. And for example, in terms of who does what, this is the typical institutional map that we do for each of the countries we're working with. And this was the case of the water resources management in Brazil. It's a federal country. There are a number of ministries in charge of different aspects of water management. In Brazil, there is a dual system between the federal level and then the subnational, which is composed by states And in some cases, responsibilities are shared with river basins, municipalities, and a number of non-governmental actors that also play a role in the implementation. This was a very difficult exercise because looking at the who does what for which function, for example, in this case, we have mapped who does what in planning, in policy implementation, in financing, monitoring, information, operational management, help clarifying if there exist gaps, if there exist gray areas, and if exist overlaps, for example. And so what we found in Brazil, but this is something that is true also for many other countries, that is not so much the problem of fragmentation, which is obviously something that has to be taken into account, the problem of the institutional fragmentation, but the problem is about coordination. So if there is institutional fragmentation, meaning that a number of ministries and different levels of government are in charge of different aspects, in this case of water resources management, it could work if they coordinate. But if they don't, there will be certainly some sort of mismatch between what has to be done by whom and what actually is implemented, because resources will become scarcer, especially when it comes to financing, because actors that have to implement don't know who to talk to and how to contribute to the implementation of policies or strategies. So the process becomes difficult, it becomes slow, and it becomes definitely less effective. So the issue here is really about coordination. But first, it's really important to understand and clarify through this type of mapping how the institution is working when it comes to water resources management, but it could be also in relation to services like drinking water and sanitation. So these are the principles that I mentioned at the beginning that were defined in 2015, and they are divided in three main groups: effectiveness, so really clarify roles and responsibility, provide policy coherence, capacity at different levels; efficiency, looking at data, financing, regulatory frameworks, and innovative governance; and then trusted engagement, transparency, stakeholder engagement, trade-off, and monitoring and evaluation. So we are now at a moment in which we are reflecting on this, the implementation of these principles, and also on how water governance may look in the future. So very briefly, I'm going to take like other 5 minutes just to highlight the three important messages on the future reflection. The first is that nowadays, and even much more compared to 10 years ago, we cannot work in silos. So I try to demonstrate that water is part of different transition, and it means that it's part of different policies. So whether these are nature related, agriculture and food, urban development and spatial planning, energy and waste, there is always water included in the implementation of any of those policies that I have just mentioned. So nowadays, working in silos, so do a water strategy or do a agriculture strategy or even a special planning strategy or policies without considering the impact on water is actually not possible anymore, because we see that without water resilience, there cannot be actually economic resilience or even social resilience at all. So we're focusing very much, for example, at the OECD on the concept on circular water economy in order to reduce the extraction of water, recover as much as possible, reuse during these cycle. For example, we have been working very specifically with 10 countries of Latin America, but we're also working on a concept that is related to the blue economy, in order to link much more effectively freshwater resources management with ocean management. The plastic that is going into the ocean nowadays is actually what is sedimented into rivers. 90% of the plastics comes from land. It's not that is and is actually going into the ocean, but it's originated in rivers and in land. So why these policies are so fragmented, why there is no coordination or effective coordination across, or sufficiently effective coordination across ministries and levels of government that are in charge either of freshwater resources or coastal management, for example. So there is the need of looking at these issues in a much better integrated way. The second message is about moving from crisis to risk management. You have seen also in South Africa what happened a few years ago, almost a call for the day zero. And there was a response that was very much related to a crisis that was kind of announced because of the data. But what happens is that this situation is now becoming more and more frequent and more regular, even in countries that were not subject to this type of stress, like, for example, in the UK. So the water governance in the future cannot just be ready to respond when the crisis would emerge. It has to be prepared to avoid the crisis, and so work very much on risk management, which combines a number of use of data. Nowadays, we have a much more access to real-time hydrology, climate forecast, demand signals. Historical averages can be replaced by probabilistic risk assessment. And then there are a number of instruments that can be adapted in relation to this risk management. For example, how water is allocated, which type of restriction should be put in place for which type of sectors. And of course, there are different decision layers that can take into account investment under uncertainty scenarios, but also some more tactical adjustment, which are more seasonal allocation and in relation to demand management. So it's not just a one type of approach. It's very much based on the type of areas we're working with, and also in terms of the timing. But it's no longer possible to just look at the crisis without being very strong on the risk management. There are a number of countries that are actually leading the way. In the Netherlands, there has been an adaptive flood risk governance through the Delta Act that created a Delta program in a country that is for the 2/3 submerged by water. And so what they did, they institutionalized long-term flood risk planning, making sure that flood and spatial planning were combined in order to reduce the exposure to risk for the population. The third and last message is that it's important to align governance and finance. There is a paradox whereby money and available resources for finance are actually, so resources, financial resources for water are actually available, but they are not used as they're supposed to. Which means that in some cases we hear complaining about water being underfinanced, and in other cases water being financed but not but projects are not being able to be delivered. This is because there is a governance issue. Investors see that there is a pipeline that is fragmented, that tariffs are unstable, that there is an unclear risk allocation, weak data, and slow delivery that can create execution risks. But also there is, in some cases, a very low credibility of institutions that need to demonstrate delivery capacity and predictable rules. And in some cases, for example, we have done a number of reports of water governance at local level. The issue of capacity at local level is something that is that represents an important limitation for the use of financial resources, because municipalities are not able to present a project proposal and then to deliver, even if the project has been funded. So it's important to move from bankability to investability at scale. Governance reform should make water investment credible, repeatable, and measurable. So there are a number of examples in terms of aligning water governance and finance. We talked, for example, with a regulator in Portugal, and they have developed benchmarking data and economic regulation that can strengthen performance and transparency, and then increase the confidence in service providers. So investment and choices in relation to infrastructure can be backed up by a data system that is really strong and that has been improving year after year. So I guess this was my last slide. I thank you very much for the attention, and I'm open to any questions you may have. And I'm stop sharing my presentation so I can see you now.
Oriana, this was a very insightful presentation, and I think I like the way into 3 different modules. I have a couple of questions myself, but let's open up to see whether there are questions from the audience before I kick off with my own questions.